Hello, and welcome to episode 46 of the Sci-Fi Podcast from Bloomington, Indiana. I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's podcast, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Francesco Guala, philosopher and experimental economist at the University of Milan, where he is professor of political economy in the Department of Philosophy. Francesco is interested primarily in the foundations and methodology of social science. His recent work focuses on social ontology and, in particular, the nature of institutions. His latest book, Understanding Institutions, proposes a new unified theory of social institutions that combines the best insights of both philosophers and social scientists. In the book, Francesco explains key institutions like money, private property, and marriage, and develops a much-needed unification of equilibrium and rules-based approaches. Moving beyond specific cases to general models and principles, Understanding Institutions offers new perspectives on what institutions are, how they work, and what they can do for us. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Francesco. Dr. Francesco Guala, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this afternoon?
I'm fine. Yeah, great. Great day. Thank you.
Great. Yeah. So, where are we speaking from? I'm currently here still in, rainy, soggy Bloomington, Indiana. Where are you calling us from?
Well, we are in sunny Milan at the moment.
Oh, wow.
Still summer, practically summer. Yeah.
Really? Oh, that's beautiful. How's the summer months been for you?
It's been very good, and I've been traveling with my family during August, and now I'm back. But we start teaching a little bit later than you guys, so this is just basically the third week of term for us. So we're just getting started.
Great. Do you and your family have any particular place you like to travel?
We very often go to the south of Italy, but we also change from year to year. And this year we went to the Azores, which are the islands right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of Portugal. Beautiful place.
Oh wow, Azores! Oh my gosh, I've never even heard of these. Is this a nice frequent destination for Europeans?
Not really, no. It's very odd, actually.
Yeah.
And there aren't many tourists. So,
right. Well, that must have been fascinating. Great. And so the term is not yet started up?
It just, teaching has just started here. And, we usually go on until June here in Italy. So we have slightly different terms from you guys, but just beginning now.
Okay. And are you teaching at all this term?
I'm not actually. I will teach after Christmas. So my teaching is changing a little bit because I have moved recently from the economics department in my university to the philosophy department in my university. And I don't know, maybe we'll talk about that later on.
I'd love to hear. Yeah. I'd love to hear about the change. Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and get started, Francesco? Why don't we start back at the beginning? Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in a small town not far from Milan, so we're in the north of Italy. The small town where I was born is called Alessandria, and it's not particularly famous compared to other Italian beautiful cities. But I grew up there, and I studied classics actually when I was in high school, which is a pretty common, or used to be a pretty common choice for middle class teenagers. And I was just lucky that I had a really good philosophy teacher when I was in high school, and so I got interested in philosophy. That's how it all started.
What kind? What kind of philosophy were you? Would gripped you at that age?
Well, the Italian curriculum in high school is based on history of philosophy. So we study, for 3 years, we study the classic philosophers, starting from Plato through antiquity and the Middle Ages, and then, up until basically the 20th century. We study it in a historical way, so it's not very much based on problems as in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, which is much more focused on philosophical problems and their solutions. But it's more based on reconstructing the development of philosophical thought through the centuries. And this is not a kind of innocent way of teaching philosophy, of course, and it is based on an idealistic notion of philosophy, which people in the early part of the 20th century, idealist philosophers were very important in Italy, so they managed to shape the teaching of philosophy in high school according to their own view of what philosophy is. So philosophy is basically the history of philosophy.
Fair enough. Yeah. So I'm wondering. So could you recall back to ages 16 and 17, if you were to describe philosophy to a friend, how did you see philosophy
back then? Yeah, I don't know. Back then, how I saw philosophy when I was 16 or 17, I guess, with hindsight, I didn't understand a lot, in the sense that, everybody is fascinated, I think, by the classical philosophers like Plato, Aristotle. I mean, the first year is fantastic and captures your attention. And then, I don't think at the time I understood a lot of what was going on after that. But I probably realized it only much later.
Sure. And were your folks encouraging of your study of philosophy? What were they up to?
So yes, they did. My dad was an entrepreneur, and I think he liked very much his job, but he was very liberal in the sense that he didn't want to force us, my brother and I. He didn't force us to take on a particular profession or go to a particular university. He just wanted us to pursue whatever we liked. And my mom, she was a teacher, and also, she was quite happy that I had this interest in philosophy. But, the turning point, I guess, was when I went to college, when I went to university, and I wasn't sure whether I wanted to study economics or philosophy. And, in retrospect, actually, I can see that, this was a kind of very significant moment, because I've been unsure about this for my whole career, I guess. Okay, so you've introduced. So it sounds like an introduction to history of philosophy was kind of what captured your attention at first. What about with economics? Well, I guess at the time, because I couldn't see myself having a career, an academic career, or making a living out of being a philosopher. I mean, it sounded just completely crazy. So studying business and economics was kind of the safe choice. And at the time, also now, I mean, there is one of the top universities in Italy, in Milan, Bocconi University, is basically an business and economics school of very high quality, where they also have some degrees that are, they're basically more theoretical, let's say, than practical. And at the time, I thought that could be a good compromise between my philosophical interests and also studying something that may be of some use later on. But anyway, in the end, I decided not to go there, and I decided to do philosophy, for totally strange reasons. I mean, basically, I had messed things up, and I didn't do the test, the entries selection test for Bocconi. So, I couldn't go there, and I said, well, never mind. I always wanted to do philosophy.
Of course.
I enrolled in philosophy at the University of Milan.
Wow. And so, how was the time at university in studying philosophy? How did your interest grow or change?
Okay, so I think one of the nice things about the curriculum in Milan at the time was that there wasn't a curriculum, in a sense, so you could study whatever you wanted to study. And the Italian philosophical community, especially during the second half of the 20th century, had been absorbing practically every school, every foreign influence, every foreign school of philosophy, or even every fad and fashion. So it was a big department, and there was a very wide choice. You could really attend lectures of philosophers who had a very different approach to philosophy, from hermeneutics to analytical philosophy of language, again, history of philosophy, or indeed philosophy of science, and over time, over the 4 years, because it was a 4-year degree, I happened to attend the lectures of a philosopher of science who he just did some really interesting and really also entertaining lectures, and that's how I got interested in philosophy of science, and I was fascinated by it.
Who was this philosopher of science?
Okay, you probably never heard of him, but his name is Giulio Giorello, and funnily, at the time, we're talking about 1990, 1992 or something like that. At the time, in retrospect, I can see that he wasn't really very interested in philosophy of science anymore, and he was more turning towards normative and ethical, political issues. So that's probably what captivated me at the time, because in a way his lectures were very diverse, and he was not really going through the sort of boring the boring philosophy of science, the basic stuff like explanation and confirmation and the foundations of probability. If he had done that, I probably wouldn't have found it very interesting. But instead, his lectures really were, about epistemology, but also about the political implications of science. And that's what I found very interesting at the time. I changed my mind later on, and now I find the boring stuff more interesting.
Now I'm a social ontologist. This is what I do. But as in your formative years in coming of age, certainly seeing how what you're studying matters in the real world, in connecting, with your current life or things, especially like political action, perhaps ethics. I could definitely see that as being a driving force. And something of interest, I'm actually noting this down in terms of just in the teaching of philosophy of science, we're often kind of deciding, okay, what to include for these, early career scholars, folks who've maybe never taken a class. And you're right. The kind of the tried and true method of just kind of a coverage model of teaching isn't always the most successful. Kids don't always like it, basically. But great. All right. So during your undergrad was a career in philosophy then starting to form, or were you still considering other options? Or what else what else was going on?
Yes, I guess at the time I really had no idea, so what I wanted to do. But then, for a few years, one thing led to another, and I didn't really have the time to think about it, or at least, every new opportunity seemed a good opportunity, so I just took it. So the first opportunity was that when I prepared my final dissertation, I was supervised by a young assistant professor who in philosophy of science, and he suggested that I wrote my dissertation on the philosophy of economics. And, in a way, again, you can see economics and philosophy coming back. And I liked it. I mean, I thought, it was an interesting topic. And when I finished, I asked him, well, if I wanted to continue to study this, where is a good place where I could go? And he said, well, you should go to the London School of Economics. So I went there, and I think there was some problem with the timing of my registration. So basically, I couldn't register for the master's in philosophy of the social sciences at the London School of Economics. So instead, I registered in the master's, the MA in philosophy of science at King's College. Which didn't make any difference. King's College is just across the road from the London School of Economics in London, and they at the time they ran their graduate teaching programs very much together. So they were just a little bit more flexible with the registration. So they allowed me to register even if I was late or something like that. So anyway, so I registered and I did my master's at King's, but I also attended many lectures at the LSE, and my supervisor was Don Gillies, philosopher of probability, and I think he was one of the last students of Karl Popper.
Oh, wow.
The dates actually are kind of significant. I went there, it was 1994, and that's when Popper died. And, when I arrived in London, I definitely found a rather different situation from the one that I expected. So what did I expect? Well, what I was taught in Italy, basically, was the Popper, Kuhn, Lakatos, Feyerabend controversies of the 1970s, 1980s. And, I thought basically that the whole discussion in philosophy of science revolved around these issues, issues of falsification, scientific progress, this kind of stuff. But when I arrived in London, obviously, I discovered that most of the philosophers had completely left that kind of discussion behind, and especially at the London School of Economics, I think Popper was kind of seen as a as a thing of the past, and he wasn't much liked, also personally, if I may say so. A lot of people didn't have particularly memories of him. So, I realized that, there were other discussions going on, and in particular, at the LSE, there was a group of people who were doing very interesting stuff in the area of philosophy of economics. And that was the group that revolved around Nancy Cartwright and Mary Morgan, who was not in the philosophy department, but she was affiliated with the Center for the Philosophy of Natural and Social Science. So it took me about a year, to get into that group and sort of understand what was going on. And, towards the end of that first year, I met one person who also would be quite important for me, which is a philosopher and decision theorist from Paris called Philippe Mongin. And Philippe was visiting the LSE at the time, and I don't remember exactly how, but we started to talk about what I wanted to do next, and he suggested I write something about decision theory and, in particular, the testing of decision theory, so empirical, experimental work in the area of decision theory. And that's what I wrote my MA dissertation about, actually MSc, sorry, it was a Master of Science, MSc dissertation.
Okay. So if you can recall, what was kind of like the main argument, the main claims in that dissertation?
Yeah, so that dissertation, I still try to apply the Lakatos framework, and Lakatos was Popper's successor at the London School of Economics, and he tried to save the best part of falsificationism, but he also is known for writing a really beautiful, exciting, long essay, which then became a book called Proofs and Refutations, which is actually not about empirical science, but it's about mathematics. And in this nice book, he tries to adapt some form of falsificationism to mathematics. Obviously, the challenge is that mathematics is not empirical. So, because decision theory is also highly mathematical, I kind of thought that I could use that framework to try to explain the development of mathematical decision theory, especially in the 1950s and 1960s, when decision theory started to bloom after the publication of von Neumann and Morgenstern's theory of games. So, I tried to adapt this kind of Lakatosian framework, and the essay actually turned out quite nicely. I mean, my main thesis is that you cannot understand the development of decision theory unless you also take into account the normative commitments of decision theorists and economists. So the idea is that there are some core principles of rationality which decision theorists are not willing to give up, even in the face of empirical data that seem to be refuting the theory. And so, if you look at different development and adaptations of decision theory to make sense of counterexamples, of empirical counterexamples, you can understand them by taking into account these rationality principles. So that was the idea, and it was quite a nice dissertation. I mean, I ended up publishing it like 4 or 5 years later, so it was quite a nice piece of work, although it took a few years to get it into a decent shape. But yeah, I'm quite proud of it.
That's fantastic. So you did your MA in King's College. And what came next? What was? Did you continue on your work in decision theory, or what were you up to next?
Okay, so by then I basically started to enjoy it.
Okay, so this was the time where you're like, okay, I could actually see doing this.
Yeah, I mean, I said, well, why not continue and do a PhD? I mean, I still, I guess, at the time I still couldn't see myself having an academic career, but they my teachers encouraged me to continue, and I said, well, why not? But I didn't want to be subsidized by my parents, so I think initially I just took a year. No, it wasn't a year off. I think I was part-time for a year, and in the meantime, I applied for various scholarships, and I was lucky, because I got 2 scholarships. One in Britain by the AHRC, which is one of the research councils that fund research, and one by the European Community. And so, I could actually do my PhD, and I was funded, and I decided to do it at the London School of Economics. So I decided to do that because the group of people who did serious philosophy of economics at the time was based at the London School of Economics.
So what kinds of questions, philosophical questions, were at the time really were coming of age with related to philosophy of economics? Like, what were some of the ones that either you worked on or others were working on at the time?
Yeah, so first of all, as I said, one important character at the time in London, but I would say, also in the philosophy of science and philosophy of economics community in general, was Nancy Cartwright. And so Nancy, she had, her early work, as you know, was on physics, basically. But by the late 1980s, she had started to do more work in the area of the philosophy of causality, and she had discovered that there was a tradition in economics of reflecting critically about causality, and especially the problem of deriving causal information from statistical information. I think that's how her partnership with Mary Morgan started. Because Mary, who is more of a historian of science, she had done some really interesting work in the history of econometrics. So in London, Nancy and Mary had set up a really lively research group that initially was called the Modeling Group, and then became the Measurement Group. And this group of scholars and young researchers, they were working on philosophical issues that have to do with the use of models in economics. And, the kind of models that they were looking at ranged from highly idealized theoretical models to very concrete applied econometric models. So this was the sort of environment where, I started to work. And I decided to look at similar issues, but from the point of view of experimental economics. Okay, so why experimental economics? Well, because when I was writing my dissertation on the early history and the philosophy of decision theory, I started to learn a lot of experimental economics, because decision theory is one of the key theories that experimental economists have been testing for many, many years. So, I kind of thought, well, it looks like a topic that no one has really looked at yet, and so this may be a really good topic to do some philosophical work that is completely new. And I didn't realize at the time that I was taking quite a big chance. I mean, it was a big risk. There wasn't a lot of literature, written on it from a philosophical or methodological point of view, and a lot of it. But at the same time, it was a big literature in the philosophy of experiments in other sciences, in physics and biology and so on. So there were some ideas that I could transfer from that literature to experimental economics. Yeah.
And so, how did that go? How did this exploration of more an empirical social science? How did you approach that as a philosopher of science? Okay,
so I approached it this way. So on the one hand, there is the usual work that we philosophers like a lot, which is the work of clarification, trying to make sense of, the sloppy talk of, of science. We talk about what they do, and, there's a little bit of interpretation and clarification, trying to say, well, you think that you're doing this, but you're not really doing this. What you're doing is slightly different. So there's a little bit of that in my thesis, but the other, I think the most interesting part of the thesis is the part where I tackle a problem that I think is ubiquitous in science, but that for peculiar reasons is not discussed very much in the natural sciences, especially physics, but it's a problem that is discussed a lot. And it's a big concern in the social sciences and in economics. So that's the problem of external validity. So what is external validity? It's the problem of applying the results, whatever findings that you have found in an experiment, and generalize it, or apply it to situations, circumstances that are sometimes very different from the one that you have studied in your laboratory. And you can imagine why physicists do not think that this is such a big deal, because they look for laws of nature. And so if you find the law of nature in the lab, surely it applies everywhere, right?
Sure.
But in economics, but also biology, medicine, psychology, people are not looking for laws of nature, and what they're looking for is usually much more local, specific causal mechanisms, causal relations, effects. And when you find one in the lab, there is always the question, say, well, okay, but how do I use this knowledge now to explain or understand what is going on in a situation that may be quite different from the sort of situation that I've created in the lab?
Sure.
And so this was a problem that I thought at the time had not been discussed very much in philosophy of science, and economists seem to have a language and also some techniques to deal with this problem, and that's what part of my dissertation was about.
Okay, that's good to hear. Good to hear. And all right. So, working with that, how was the dissertation received?
Okay, so I think it was well received, very well received, actually, in the in the small community of philosophy and methodology of economics. Yeah. And I got some of the chapters published pretty much straight away after the dissertation was finished.
This is like experimental localism and external validity.
That was a chapter of my dissertation. So the early papers that I published, in 1999, 2000, 2001, they were all bits and pieces of my dissertation. And initially, I published in the specialized journals like, Economics and Philosophy, Journal of Economic Methodology. But I realized that, in order to have a career as a philosopher of science, I also needed to engage with, philosophers of science who are not specialists in the in the philosophy of economics. Yeah. So experimental localism, actually, that paper, which ended up in philosophy of science, was an attempt to sort of generalize the problem. It's a discussion of external validity, the problem of external validity, but it was an attempt to generalize the problem beyond economics, and to sort of argue that it's a general issue for any science, for any experimental science. And, that was a little bit more difficult. So, over the years, like any young scholar, I guess, I had a number of rejections by major philosophy of science journals. Yeah. But what was a little bit frustrating was that very often the rejection was not based on some kind of, flaw in the arguments of my papers, but it was more like, well, this may be interesting for philosophy of economics, but we are a general philosophy of science. Oh. We are not really interested in this stuff. And this kind of reaction reflected the relatively low status that the philosophy of economics had at the time within the philosophy of science community.
Sure.
So philosophy of science in general, we're talking about now, 2000, early 2000s. It was definitely becoming more diverse, and it was not as physics based as it was, say, 20 or 30 years ago. But at the same time, the areas that were developing very fast and that were growing enormously were, basically, the philosophy of biology, philosophy of cog science, they were regrowing fast. Whereas the philosophy of social science and the philosophy of economics were still considered pretty much at the fringe of the discipline. So it was a little bit difficult at the time to engage with other philosophers of science and to sort of demonstrate that you could do serious work in philosophy of science focusing on economics.
Yeah. Well, it seems like you successfully have done that. I mean, is this something? So this is an issue that current scholars are, folks like myself are running into in terms of generalizing their highly focused, highly specific problems to the general field. Is this something you'd still recommend to your students, or in general, or is this something you still try to do in your own work? Right.
Yes. So, this is the challenge, I think, of contemporary philosophy of science. So maybe I will say more about this later when you ask me the final question.
Yeah, sure. We can jump back. Yeah.
But, just to answer quickly, I think it's absolutely crucial that especially young scholars, but also older scholars, write about science that they know well. So you cannot be a serious philosopher of science nowadays unless you are technically proficient in a scientific discipline. And it's very difficult, unfortunately, to be proficient in philosophy and at the same time also, in biology or in physics or in cognitive science or in economics. It's just a matter of time. Our time is limited. You cannot know everything, especially when you're young. So you have to make this investment and, specialize. But at the same time, you should also remember that our job, I think, this is my view, okay, that our job as philosophers is to sort of try to come up with ideas that are of general significance. And, if you become too narrow in your interest, I think you're going to lose, what philosophy of science, or what philosophy is interesting for, which is its capacity to have a general look at the world and human beings and how they know about the world. So we should try to make a compromise between this increased specialization and the capacity to generalize.
Yeah, I would agree. I definitely would agree. It's a delicate balance.
It's very difficult. That's the problem.
Yeah. Okay. Well, great. So your study and your time, concluded at LSE. What came next? How was the job search for you?
Okay. Yeah. So I was very disorganized in my job search. I later, especially when I met my peers who were finishing their PhDs in American universities, I realized how much more organized they were. And they also had a lot more support by their faculties than we did. So I think at the time, the job market search was still very much amateurish in the UK. But at the same time, we were lucky because the job market was very lively, and there just were job opportunities out there. So I applied for a few jobs, but I didn't apply to a lot of jobs. And in retrospect, I realized how lucky I've been to land a job pretty much straight away. But I took a huge risk. So I focused on the UK for two reasons. First, because it is the most lively job market academically in Europe. And secondly, because my impression back then, but I think it's probably still true nowadays, is that it's more difficult to find a job in the US if you have a European PhD than do the opposite, you know.
Sure.
So I didn't try very seriously the American academic job market. But so I was lucky, and I was lucky because at the University of Exeter, which is in the southwest of England, they had decided to restart the philosophy program that had been it had been closed, I think, 15 years earlier in the 1980s. And they had decided to restart philosophy teaching because, for various reasons, but, you know, there seemed to be demand for, students wanted to study philosophy. So they started to hire, and I was the second person to be hired. I was hired by, the first philosopher who was hired there was John Dupre. And, John was a former colleague of Nancy Cartwright at Stanford. And he had recently moved to the UK following his wife. He decided to, embark in this exciting project of restarting philosophy at the University of Exeter. Yeah. And so he decided to hire me. Oh. And I can see why. I mean, because basically he could see that the stuff that I did, was in the same spirit as what he, but also Nancy and others were beginning to call the Stanford School of Philosophy of Science. And, what is the Stanford School? Well, it's this group of people, including like Ian Hacking and Peter Gallison, who started to study the practice of science much more seriously, and especially experimental science, much more seriously than the previous generation of philosophers had done. And John obviously liked that approach, but he was also interested in the philosophy of social science, the philosophy of economics. So he was keen to hire somebody like me, and that's how I ended up in Exeter. That was 1999, and together we designed this new philosophy program, and it was very exciting. You're right out of graduate school, and you have this opportunity of shaping, the teaching of philosophy in a new place. So that was very exciting. Yeah. And
so what kinds of thoughts went into this shaping? This is actually must have been a wonderful opportunity. So what did you consider? What it ended up coming to be in terms of?
It was partly shaped by the human resources that we had at the time, and apart from new hirings, we also relied a lot on people who had philosophical interest in the departments of political science and the department of sociology, and in particular in sociology. Barry Barnes, the sociologist of science, was the chair of sociology at the time, and therefore, we designed a program that catered on these interests. Now, John, I remember at the time, he said, "Well, we cannot compete with, Oxford or, these other departments where they offer all the core teaching in philosophy, and they do it wonderfully. So what we can do, though, is to try to specialize, in some areas." And, he called it a donut department or a donut program, in the sense that, all the tasty stuff is at the fringe, but there's nothing in the middle. There's just a big hole in the middle. So we had, a lot of, political philosophy and, philosophy of social science, philosophy of economics, philosophy of biology, but we had just the minimal stuff in core, let's say, epistemology, and metaphysics, these kind of areas. We partly because we were not very good at that, so
Sure.
we decided to invest more energies and shape the program, around the things that we were good at. And at the time, it seemed that the philosophy of social science would be one of the core themes, which was only partly the case because just 3 or 4 years later, John got a large grant. Actually, John and Barry Barnes together, they got a very large grant to set up a research center on genomics, the philosophy and sociology of genomics. So this was part of the big investment of the UK government on, the human project, and set up this research center. And at that time, clearly, Exeter became a major center for the philosophy of biology, and nowadays, I guess this is what is probably best known for.
Yeah.
But I didn't see that as a problem. I mean, actually, I enjoyed enormously the time that I was there, and it was entirely natural that things would turn out that way. And I kept teaching there, and I learned a lot from all the people who were there. So I had a wonderful time there.
Great. And so was this at the time that you were writing one of your first books, The Methodology of Experimental Economics?
That's right. So what happened is that in 2002, Vernon Smith and Danny Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in economics, and they won it for their work in experimental economics and behavioral economics. Mm-hmm. So, at the time, I was playing with the idea of writing a book on external validity, the problem of extrapolating experimental findings and applying them outside of the lab. And my idea was, I need to learn more about how these problems are tackled, for example, in biology, so that, I can write a general philosophy of science book about this topic. Yeah. Now, luckily, I didn't do that because at the time, I didn't know it, but at the time there were 2 people who were working on the same issues.
Yeah.
And, these 2 people were Daniel Steele, and, he ended up writing this, there's...
No, that's okay.
Sorry, so I'll restart. So there were, these 2 people, Dan Steele and what's his name? Marcel Weber. Yes, sorry. So Dan Steele and Marcel Weber were working on roughly the same topics in biology, in the philosophy of biology, and they both ended up writing 2 very nice books on these topics. And if I had tried to compete with that, they would have written better books than mine, and they would have come out. So in 2002, when I was thinking about these things, not knowing the fierce competition that was out there, the Nobel Prize announcement came out, and when it came out, I kind of thought, I'm really stupid if I don't publish a book on the methodology of experimental economics now, because this is the time to do it. So I changed my plan rather quickly, and I think it took me about a year or so to put together all the articles and some of the material that was in my dissertation and to put it in the shape of a book. And as I was doing that, obviously, I realized that there were a lot of things that I had to rewrite. So in the end, the book is really quite different from my dissertation and also some of the articles. But yeah, the book, was proposed to Cambridge University Press, and Cambridge at the time had a really good editor, a wonderful editor in the area of history and philosophy of economics, Scott Paris, and he liked the project. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know that, but some of his consultants, the people who read my manuscript, were people like Vernon Smith, who just won the Nobel Prize, and,
wow.
Harrison and Bob Sugden, and they all liked it. And I must say, this is something that I think applies to science in general, but especially to new science like experimental economics. The scientists who do innovative work have a tremendous interest and also tremendous talent for philosophy. And so all these people, their reaction was not, oh, what does this guy want? Who is he? What does this philosopher want from us? What is he talking about? No, their attitude was very much, wow, this philosophical stuff is very interesting for us. We didn't know that, there was all this interesting stuff in philosophy. And that started a conversation, which has been going on for years. And it was great.
That's really great to hear. So that is, the kind of the assumption that you just said prior, kind of, oh, who is this person kind of coming about, that as assuming that, some sort of either behavioral, social economist or other scientist can it appreciates the kind of work. And certainly we hear stories like that. Is there something about the way you've approached the problem or the way you've written that you think helps to open that door to?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, definitely. So, this is so important. I think we manage to annoy scientists, whenever, we try to preach to scientists. Mm-hmm. And, there is a tradition in philosophy of science, that, does this kind of preaching. And it's pretty obvious that it doesn't work. I mean, first of all, we usually know a lot less than they do about, the subject matter. And so it's kind of funny that, we try to tell them, oh, you should do this or you should do that, or, your methodology doesn't make sense. Now, in economics in particular, there has been a tendency to do that, but there has also been a tendency by some frustrated economists to turn to philosophers to sort of, point the way towards, a better way of doing economics. And, these frustrated economists usually have not found a very receptive audience within their discipline. So, typically, these kind of what I call frustrated economists are, people who are unhappy about so-called orthodox or neoclassical economics. And so, they try to find philosophical reasons to reject what mainstream economists do, and mainstream economists, at that point, they tend to become rather annoyed, and also, sometimes they tend to think that philosophy hasn't got anything to teach because they already know how to do good economic science. Now, with experimenters, it has been different because, experimenters had to face a lot of skepticism from their own peers in the 1960s, 1970s, and it took them a long time before their methodology and their results became accepted in the discipline. Now it is widely accepted. Every department of economics has some experimental economists. They publish in the best journals. They got Nobel Prizes. So it's been a huge success, but it was hard. And when it was hard, they had to face methodological and philosophical objections to what they were doing. So, these pioneers, they really had to think hard about what they were doing and why they were doing it that way. A lot of them were not philosophically learned or sophisticated. So I guess when I wrote my book, and I wrote it in a way so as to engage with them, not to preach, but, just to to show them that, together we can learn something. So philosophers can learn from economics and economists can learn from philosophy. So with that spirit, I think, they realized that indeed, that there was room for improvement on both sides. And I think that's why I think my work has been successful also in engaging economists.
Fantastic. I think those are some valuable lessons to learn for current and future philosophers of science. Okay, great. So, at teaching at Exeter, obviously you're at University of Milan now. How did that change come about?
Okay, yeah. So it occurred for various reasons. I think on the one hand, I had been at Exeter for almost 10 years, and there comes a point where you also like the idea of maybe changing environment. I mean, in which you're working, and there was absolutely nothing wrong, with my department. I liked being there, but at the same time, I think changing seemed like maybe a good idea. Also to get, new stimuli from different people. And then, there were personal reasons. My wife and I just had kids, and our kids started to go to school, and, we had to decide. I think suddenly we had to decide where we wanted to live, in the sense that we could see that at some point it would have become more difficult to move somewhere else, when your kids grow a little bit older. So when my kids were like 4 or 6 years old, I had this opportunity of going back to Italy with a new program sponsored by the Ministry of Education that tried to attract expats back in the country. So it was kind of anti-brain drain program. So I applied and I got this scholarship, this grant. And, the university that was more receptive was the University of Milan, but funnily, in the Department of Economics. So I had this opportunity of moving from philosophy to economics, and I said, well, why not? It was actually a very good offer, because, it was basically a pure research position for 4 years. So, it was very attractive.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So you've been here now for how long?
Well, I guess almost another 10 years.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, great. Okay, so I guess why don't we, take a little bit of time to maybe talk about some of your favorite works, and perhaps your the Ontho Contrary section on your website. I found this pretty interesting. So if you don't know, if you've gone to Francesco's website, he has a list, just like many other scholars, of his research and publications, and then at the very bottom of the research it says, surprisingly, some people disagree with me. If you want to know why, have a look here, which I think is wonderful. I mean, it shows participation and engagement in the discussion. So maybe we could talk about that, actually, some pretty, if you have any stories or of interesting disagreements between you and other noted philosophers of science. Some I see that have even been on the podcast. I see, folks in, economics, models, simulations, and more, problem of external validity, etc. So, yeah, do you have anything to share about that?
Okay, so I think that I am pretty bad at forecasting which parts of my research are going to catch other people's attention. So sometimes I am surprised. I think I've written a really provocative article and nobody cares about it. And sometimes another article which I thought was not particularly good steers quite a lot of discussion. So what are my favorites? Well, I guess one totally unexpected article of mine that steered quite a bit of discussion is an article that I wrote many years ago on simulations. And, this was part of my experimental economics project, in the sense that I was trying to make sense of the difference between simulations and experiments. And, the thesis in this article is that the methodology of simulation and the methodology of experiments is actually quite similar, but the basic difference is that in experiments you deal with material systems, And therefore, by experimenting with material things, you are able to learn different things than what you would learn normally in a simulation. So this idea, which at the time seemed pretty simple to me and not particularly controversial, instead, has been very popular, and it has been cited a lot. And then, the discussion, the debate on the methodology of simulation took off, and there are now many interesting works on simulation that engage with this materiality thesis. Another favorite of mine is the article on reciprocity, and this is slightly different because this had a big success in psychology and also economics. And this was a paper that became a target article in behavioral and brain science. And with this paper, I basically criticize a prominent interpretation of a series of experiments that have been performed by very famous economists and anthropologists like Boyd, Richardson, Fair, Gintis, and so on. And I think with that paper, I kind of hit a nerve in the sense that there were a lot of people around who were very skeptical about this way of doing experiments and interpreting experiments. And so this paper steered a big discussion with very strong replies by some of these people, and it's still quoted a lot. I mean, I'm always surprised. It continues to be cited. It's kind of become a sort of reference point in this literature. I'm particularly proud of this paper because this is a typical example of a paper is written by a philosopher of science with there's some important philosophy of science arguments in this paper and distinctions, the sort of things that we like to do in philosophy. But at the same time, it is directed, it tries to engage with some questions that are live questions in today's science. So it to make a contribution to a scientific debate. And, this is something that we as philosophers of science only manage to do rarely. I mean, I think too rarely. And when we do it, I think we should be happy and proud of it because, it means that we are useful.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah. So this is the BBS article. That's I think, and obviously the format of this is wonderful. So it's always great to see a philosopher of sciences work like yourself in here. And yeah, I'm seeing it now. Quite a few. Yeah, you get dozens of great responses and great thoughts on your work. So great. Well, that's interesting. Okay. So what about lastly, your one of your more recent works, Understanding Institutions: The Science and Philosophy of Living Together.
Yep.
Yeah. So can you tell me? Let's talk a little bit about that and what came about, what brought this kind of book about, and what prompted you to write this kind of work.
Yeah. So when I finished the methodology of experimental economics, I knew that there were still a lot of things to say about it, and I continued to work in that area for years. I mean, I still occasionally do it. Also, to continue the conversation with other people, who are also working in that area. But at the same time, I was also trying to think about other topics, and basically I was beginning to think about the next project, something slightly different. And at the time I realized that I had an asset that very few philosophers had. And that asset was that I actually knew how to do empirical work, experimental work. So if and we need to go back a little bit here, but when I was at Exeter, I started some collaborations with other experimental economists, and I was very keen to learn how to do experiments, because if you don't do the science yourself, I think you don't get a feeling of what the methodological issues are. So I started to collaborate every now and then, and I actually started to publish in experimental economics, and this is what later allowed me to be in an economics department in Milan as an economist, as somebody who could contribute to the economics literature. So, I had this asset. I was a philosopher, but at the same time, I also was able to do experimental work. And I thought, well, how can I use this combination of skills? And one area that seemed very interesting to me was the area of where experimental economics and behavioral economics engages with normative issues that have to do, for example, with cooperation, morality, social norms, and so on. Mm-hmm. So I started to work a little bit in that area, and in particular, I started to work on coordination and cooperation, doing experiments and writing, philosophical papers, but also scientific papers. So that's how I got in the area of interested in the area of social ontology.
Yeah.
Social ontology at the time was, we're talking about 10 years ago, was beginning to develop quickly, and the big new thing was collective intentionality theory. Mm-hmm. But what I found interesting was that the area was attracting, the debate was attracting people with very different backgrounds. So it was very different from traditional philosophy of social science. Now, the social ontology literature was a combination of people interested in metaphysics on the one hand, people interested in action theory, but also people interested in cognitive science, people interested in economics, experimental economics like me, so psychology. So it was kind of a very interesting area. And so I worked a little bit on these topics, and my idea was to do some experimental philosophy. Okay, experimental philosophy was another buzzword about 10 years ago. So I thought, well, maybe I can do some experimental philosophy, social science, or something like that. And so I was working on that and sort of accumulating, papers and publications, but I still couldn't figure out, I hadn't had, an idea or, some kind of story that I could use to, to write a book about. I had actually started to think about a book project that would be about cooperation and coordination. And the cognitive foundations of cooperation and coordination. But I kind of realized at some point that I had nothing particularly new or distinctive to say about it. I mean, there were a lot of things that I disliked in the literature, but my take on these issues was rather traditional. I mean, basically, I thought that, brilliant economists like Robert Frank or Bob Sugden in the 1980s, they had already basically got it right. And people were just forgetting about this work that had been done 30 years ago. But writing a book just to say that, seemed terribly boring.
Sure.
So, I had this kind of, mess of kind of half manuscripts when something happened. And what happened is that Frank Hendricks, whom is a slightly younger scholar than I am, working also on philosophy of economics, and I knew him. I've known him for many years. But anyways, he came to Milan a few years ago, and he gave a brilliant seminar. And in this seminar, he presented an idea that I suddenly saw, could be developed in a very, very interesting direction. So, combined with some of the things that I had done, I realized that we could use this idea to build a theory of institutions. So I talked to Frank. Actually, no, I didn't talk to him. Actually, I wrote up. I wrote up very quickly, like a couple of short papers, something, or short chapters, I don't remember. And I sent these to him, and I said, look, here's what I got from your seminar, and I think, we can develop this in this direction, and, we can do some really fantastic stuff. And Frank was really nice because, it's very easy in these situations, to be defensive and say, oh, this is my idea. I want to develop, the idea this way, and, I don't want to share it with you. But instead, he said, no, that's great. I mean, I hadn't thought about this in this way, so let's do it together.
Yeah.
And so we wrote up these 2 papers together on institutions, and we published them. But at the same time, I realized that a lot of the material that I had for my kind of aborted book could be rewritten around this new idea, this new theory of institutions, and so I did it. And I did it rather quickly, I must say. It took me probably a year or so to write up all this material again in a different form. And that's how Understanding Institutions was born, which is a book which is rather different from the previous one. So the previous one, was the result of many, many years of thinking about the same topic, and a lot of papers, submitted, revised, painstakingly corrected. But this one was different. It was kind of written in one go, and it's very raw, I think.
Yeah.
But at the same time, so I know that, I knew it, when I decided to publish it anyways, that it was kind of raw, and there were a lot of things that needed fixing. But I also thought, and I hope that I'm right, that it's a book that tries to look at the debate in social ontology from a new perspective, different perspective from most people, and it kind of points to new ideas and new directions that can be developed. So I see it more like the beginning of a lot of work that I hope other people are going to do, rather than the kind of end point of a research project.
Yeah. No, it sounds. I'm looking at it now. It looks fascinating. And so what is a social institution? So the core idea is this, that in our theory, which we call the rules in equilibrium theory of institutions, we combine the 2 traditional, the most prominent accounts of institutions that are found in the philosophical and in the scientific literatures. So these 2 traditions are the rules tradition and the equilibria tradition. So one sees institutions as rules, and the other one sees institutions as equilibria of strategic gains. Now, what we do is to show that these 2 ways of understanding institutions are actually complementary. So they're not necessarily in competition with one another, but they just focus on different aspects of the same thing. But this is just the first step. The next step, which I think is what got me excited initially, was that we can use this also to criticize some prominent philosophical views, some views that have become super popular and super famous in philosophy. And, we begin with John Searle's theory of institutions, based on the idea of constitutive rules. And I don't want to sound too, cocky about it, but I really do think that we criticize it in a way that cannot be recovered. And in our articles and in my book, there is the definite critique of John Searle's theory. Now, it's a critique in a sense that it doesn't say that the theory is completely worthless, but we can show that this theory, which looks very esoteric and rather complicated, is actually perfectly reducible to the rules in equilibrium account. So it's not a new theory. I mean, it's just, it's just a fancy formulation of views that have been around for some time. Yeah.
This is one of the accomplishments, especially in the first part of my book and in the 2 articles with Frank. But in the second part of the book, I also tackle a number of other issues that have been discussed a lot in the philosophy of social science literature. So I discussed the problems of reflexivity and performativity, and I discussed the problem of mind dependence, and language dependence of social reality. These are classic issues.
Yeah.
The philosophy of social science and social ontology. And what I try to do in the book is to show that using the theory of institutions that we have devised, a lot of the puzzles disappear or can be solved in a way that makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, you can use that part of the book also as a big overview of the philosophy of social science debates of the last 20 years, but from a different perspective, from a very opinionated point of view.
Fantastic. Okay. All right. Well, I look forward to, I must say, I haven't read the book yet, but I'm looking forward to reading it.
Well, then let me know what you think.
Well, so before we get into our last question, I just wanted to catch us up. What's kind of currently on the horizon? What are you currently thinking about and working on?
Okay, so as I said just a second ago, I mean, I know that there are a lot of parts of understanding institutions that are unsatisfactory. They are underdeveloped, and so I'm doing two things. I mean, on the one hand, I'm trying to make some progress on the central chapter, the central two chapters of the book that are on the cognitive foundations of institutions. And when I wrote these two chapters, I was fully aware that I was just sketching some ideas that would require a lot more work, and in particular, the ideas about the roles of beliefs in facilitating coordination and rule following. I am aware that they require a lot of more work. So this is one area where I'm trying to do more work, and I might devote quite a lot of time to this in the next few years. But on the other hand, I'm also listening. What is nice is that there are quite a few reviews that have come out, and there's a book symposium that is now published on the journal Philosophy of the Social Sciences. And, some of the commentators, some of the reviewers have already identified some flaws or some problems that I hadn't seen myself. And, some of these objections are really hard. So they're forcing me to think or rethink some issues. This is something that I should definitely do in the future. And, I guess, with the previous book, I kind of had the feeling when I wrote it that I didn't have a lot more to say about these issues. I mean, I was also kind of exhausted, having thought about the same things for like 10 years. I was keen to change topic. But in this case, no. I mean, I kind of feel that, there's probably more to say, and there are other things that I can contribute to these discussions. So, this is what I think I'm going to work on, social ontology, for a few years. Great.
Okay. Well, so let's conclude with the final question of our interview, which is what is the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today, according to you?
The $1 billion question.
$1 billion question.
It's I think the challenge for philosophy of science is the same challenge that philosophy as a whole faces. And it is maybe more pressing or more difficult for philosophers of science, but it's just a version of the general question. And the general challenge, the general question is, why should there be philosophy today? And I think this is, a question that has a kind of intellectual side, but also an institutional side. We're used to having philosophy departments, our universities, and, we have journals of philosophy and philosophy conferences. But it's not obvious at all to me that things should have turned out this way and that they will be this way in the future. Why? Well, here is where the philosopher of science comes in. I mean, it seems to me that the central question for the last 150 years, maybe, of philosophy has been, what is the role and the room for philosophy in contemporary culture, a culture that is dominated by science. And it is. I'm just saying, something completely trivial. We all know that a lot of questions and a lot of answers to these questions that used to be philosophical now are not philosophical anymore. If you were a philosopher 300 or 400 years ago, you would think and talk about issues like, what is physical reality constituted of, or what is time, or what is life. A lot of issues that today are not purely philosophical issues anymore. And we philosophers continue to talk about these things, but we do it in partnership with science. And some of the most interesting insights have come from science, not from philosophy, in these areas. So the area, the domain of philosophy has been shrinking, and it's not obvious to me that there will be a separate discipline, a separate area called philosophy in the future. Now, one trend over the last, I would say, 50 or 60 years has been to one reaction of philosophers has been to retrench. And for example, I see the rise of analytical metaphysics over the last few decades as a reaction to this. I mean, as an attempt to find some topics that can be discussed without caring too much about science, and coming up with problems. Sometimes, I'm afraid, pseudo problems that are purely philosophical. Now, we philosophers of science do not like that very much, and we are much more ready than our colleagues that work, say, in moral philosophy or metaphysics. We are much more ready to engage with scientists and, to discuss with them issues that lie at the borders between science and philosophy. But I've seen it in my career, and I can see it as a trend in general philosophy of science, is that this has led to increased specialization. So that's why I didn't want to answer this question earlier, when you asked me about specialization. But what has happened is that the philosophy of science has become a lot more specialized, and we as philosophers of science have fewer topics that we all know and we all master than previous generations. So, if we go back 30 or 40 years, there were topics in general philosophy of science that every philosopher of science would know about, like, confirmation, testing, explanation, maybe causation, and so on. Nowadays, it's not like that anymore. I can see that, the common ground between us is shrinking. And this is partly because we have found that there aren't many general things that we can say about these topics that are not subject specific. And partly because, each one of us, need to look for new, interesting puzzles and questions and problems. And we find many of these problems and questions inside scientific disciplines. So we need to become much more specialized. Now, this is, I think, is creating a situation where philosophy of science is becoming more scattered and less unified. It's a disunification of philosophy of science. I can see that in the long run, this may lead even to the disappearance of philosophy of science. And people who want to do serious good philosophy of science, they have to know so much physics or so much biology or so much economics that they will have to be physicists or biologists or economists and work in these departments in order to be up to date with the latest science. And this may create a situation where, unfortunately, on the one hand, the philosophers who engage with live questions that come up from the sciences, migrate toward the sciences, and on the other hand, the philosophers who remain in philosophy, retrench and end up, engaging in scholastic debates about issues that are of little importance. I know that this reflects a prejudice on my part, but I see this as one possible development, and it's not a development that I particularly like. So partly because I was raised and educated in a philosophy environment, and I think there is something good about philosophy that we should try to preserve, and partly to do with this capacity to engage with interdisciplinary discussions. But I don't have a recipe. I mean, I'm not exactly sure, especially what is the kind of education and the kind of training that we should provide for younger scholars in order to avoid this fate. So I don't want to end up on a pessimistic note, but I do think that this is the major challenge for the next generation, or maybe the next two or three generations.
Okay. All right. Well said. And I appreciate you articulating your thoughts on that. Well, Francesco, we've taken up a little bit more than your planned time, but I thank you for hanging out and staying with us and filling us in on a number of your excellent works and responses and everything. And I really appreciate you taking the time to chat.
Well, thank you. I mean, it was wonderful. Sometimes, if you don't talk about these general questions, you kind of think that you have some ideas, but it was very nice, articulating these ideas with you. So thank you for doing this.
Of course.
Great service.
All right. Of course. Well, have a wonderful rest of your day, rest of your week. Will you be happening to attend the Philosophy of Science Association this year?
I'm not going this year. Hopefully next year.
Okay. All right. Well, enjoy the rest of your summer months there in Italy, and good luck with the start of the new semester.
Okay. Thank you. Hope to see you soon in person.
Absolutely. Okay. Take care, Francesco. Bye-bye.
Bye.